Monitor had been screaming for 11 seconds when paramedic Elena Marsh drove the heel of her hand into the man's sternum for the 16th time, and the CFO of Northgate Regional Health Centre walked through the bay doors, looked directly at the man dying on the table, and said 5 words that Elena would spend the next 4 days replaying in the exact sequence they arrived. Stop. Move her back. Now. Not because the patient was beyond saving. Because the provincial infrastructure delegation was watching through the glass panel in the corridor, and Northgate's CFO had a presentation in 40 minutes that he needed this hallway for. What Elena did next, what she refused to stop doing, and what it cost her before anyone in a position of authority finally said enough. That is not the story most hospital administrators would want told out loud, but it is the story that happened. And it happened in Clearwater Bay, Ontario, on a Tuesday in February, when the ice on Georgian Bay was still thick enough to walk on, and the maple trees along Hospital Road were bare and black against a sky the color of old pewter. Drop your city in the comments. Elena wants to know how far this one travels. She had been doing 12-hour shifts for 3 weeks straight because the scheduling coordinator had gone on medical leave and nobody had filled the gap in any meaningful way, which was the kind of institutional oversight that didn't look like negligence until someone was standing in the break room at 4 a.m. eating a granola bar that had been in their locker since October and trying to remember what day it was. Elena Drake was 32 years old, and she had been working emergency and trauma response in Clearwater Bay for 4 years. 2 with the regional paramedic service, and 2 cross-trained in the hospital's ER intake unit under a pilot partnership program that the province kept threatening to defund, and then didn't. Before Clearwater Bay, she had done 3 years in Northern Ontario with a fly-in medical response team that served 14 remote First Nations communities, flying into situations where the phrase, "the nearest hospital is 4 hours away," was not a reason to slow down, but simply a parameter you worked inside. Before that, she had done her emergency medical training on an accelerated timeline while working nights at a pulp mill in Kapuskasing to pay for it, which meant she had graduated with debt that was almost manageable and hands that had learned to stay steady in loud, dark, complicated environments. She was not a person who required recognition. She was not a person who needed the work to be acknowledged in order to keep doing it. She was a person who had chosen a specific kind of work because she was constitutionally unable to be somewhere else when people needed what she knew how to do. And that was not a quality that translated easily into performance reviews or administrative approval, but it was the quality that mattered at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning when the ambulance bay doors opened and 2 paramedics from the overnight crew brought in a man who had been found face down on the shoulder of Highway 26 with no wallet, no phone, and pulse that had spent the last 8 minutes deciding whether it wanted to continue. He was somewhere in his early 50s, large through the shoulders, a face that had been shaped by something more demanding than office work. The kind of jaw tension, the particular hollowness around the eyes, that Elena associated with people who had spent time in environments that asked everything of them. His jacket was civilian, but the boots were not. Vibram-soled, worn to the specific degree that suggested real terrain rather than a weekend market. His hands had calluses in places that told a story she filed away without acting on. Dr. Anika Patel was the attending on duty. She was 41, unhurried in the way of someone who had decided long ago that urgency and composure were not opposites, and she directed intake traffic with the minimal but precise language of someone who had done this enough times that the choreography was unconscious. BP? Elena asked, pulling on gloves. 55 over palp, the overnight paramedic said. We had him at 68, briefly. He went under about 3 minutes out. He was conscious for maybe 30 seconds when we found him. Said something. Couldn't make it out. She looked at the man's face and catalogued what she saw, the way she catalogued everything in intake. Not slowly, not with drama, just accurately and completely, because accuracy was the only thing that mattered here. They worked. For the first 19 minutes, it was the controlled, efficient chaos of a team that had done this together before, and the rhythm was good, and the communication was the kind that didn't require full sentences, because the room knew what it was doing. Then his heart stopped. Not a dramatic crash, Just the flat line with a single sustained tone that meant the conversation had changed. "He's in VF," Dr. Patel said. "Elena, compressions." She was already there. What followed was 6 minutes of work that Elena would later describe in a formal statement with clinical precision and very few adjectives. Because clinical precision was the appropriate language for what had happened, and adjectives were for the version of events you told yourself at 2 a.m. when the shift was over. Effective CPR on an adult male with a large frame required force. It required sustained depth and rate without softening, without accommodating the sounds that a body under effective compression made, and Elena had been trained in an environment where the instruction had been delivered simply. If you go soft in the middle, the tissue dies. She did not go soft. She did not see the group assemble in the corridor. Northgate Regional Health Centre's quarterly provincial engagement review had been planned for 6 weeks. Douglas Merritt, the CFO, had organized it with the thoroughness of a man who understood that his position at the top of a mid-sized regional hospital depended not on the clinical metrics. Those were Dr. Dawes, Patel's department, and 3 other departments before that, but on the optics of the clinical metrics. The difference between those two things was something Merritt had never been asked to examine closely, and so had not examined. He was 53, silver at the temples in a way that photographed well in annual reports, possessed of the particular confidence that accumulated in people who had spent 20 years in hospital finance and administration without ever being on the receiving end of a decision they made. He had come up through budget management, then operations, then the executive track, and he had brought 7 provincial health ministry representatives through the corridor outside the trauma wing because the architecture photographed beautifully, and because he had timed the tour to avoid the morning intake rush. He had not accounted for the emergency admission. He had not accounted for any of it. The glass panel along the trauma corridor gave the delegation a clear sight line into Bay 2. What they were watching at 6,053 in the morning was Elena Drake on a step stool to gain leverage, applying her full weight to compressions on the largest patient currently in the building, while Dr. Patel called intervals and the monitor communicated the situation with the volume and insistence it had been designed for. Merritt did not see any of that. What he saw was something that looked to his untrained eye like controlled violence, and what he registered was the effect it was having on the faces of 3 ministry representatives who had stepped closer to the glass. He turned to the administrator beside him. "Who authorized this? Why is it visible from here?" "Sir," the administrator said carefully, "that's an emergency resuscitation." "I know what it is. I need to know why it's happening where the delegation can see it." "Because that's where the patient is." The administrator appeared to regret saying it immediately. Merritt straightened his jacket, looked once at the ministry representatives, and pushed open the door to Bay 2. The room shifted. Not dramatically. Just the specific reorientation of attention that happened when someone entered a space with the energy of institutional ownership. Dr. Patel looked up once. "Sir, this is not a good time." "I need this resolved," Merritt said. "The delegation is in the corridor. This is the first room they see." Patel's voice went very flat. "We are in the middle of a resuscitation." Elena kept her hands moving. She was at the 3-minute mark of the current compression cycle, and her arms were working correctly, and she was not going to stop because a man in a pressed shirt had walked into the room with a different agenda. "The patient needs CPR," she said without looking up. "Unless you're here to assist, I need you to step back." Merritt turned to look at her with the specific expression of someone who had just noticed a piece of furniture had spoken. "I'm the chief financial officer of this institution. And he's in ventricular fibrillation with a pressure that was 55 over palp 20 minutes ago," Elena said. "If I stop compressions right now, we will lose him." "Sir." The last word was punctuation, not deference. Patel had gone very still in the way physicians went, still when they were watching a situation develop and had not yet decided whether to intervene. Merritt looked at the patient, at the monitors, at Elena's hands, which had not stopped, which were maintaining depth and rate with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned this in conditions that left no room for softness. He looked at the delegation through the glass panel, and Elena watched him run a calculation she recognized without needing it explained to her. And then he looked back and said, with the perfect calm of a man who had confused his authority for something it was not, "Stop the compressions." The room went a different kind of quiet. The provincial representatives are deciding whether to approve the infrastructure funding for this facility's expansion, Merritt said. His voice had dropped to something almost conversational, which was somehow worse than if he had raised it. What is happening in this room right now is not something I can allow to be the image those people carry out of this building. Elena looked up at him once. Just once. "Till die," she said. "I understand the clinical risk." She heard Patel draw a breath behind her. And then Merritt did something that would later be described in 4 separate incident reports with nearly identical language. He stepped forward and put his hand on Elena's shoulder and pulled. He did not get far. She shrugged his hand off with a force that rocked him sideways, pivoted back to the patient, adjusted her grip, and resumed compressions. "Don't touch me while I'm working," she said. It was not loud. It was not performed. It was simply the flattest sentence in the room. Merritt stood slightly off balance. His face went through several colors. "You're finished here," he said. "Badge, scrubs, and out of my building in the next 10 minutes. Do you understand me?" "Fire me tomorrow," Elena said. "Write whatever you need to write. But right now, I'm at 3 minutes 40 into this cycle, and in about 20 seconds, we're going to attempt defibrillation, and I need you out of the way." Dr. Patel moved to the crash cart. Merritt did not move. "Charging," Patel said. "Clear." The room held its breath. The defibrillator discharged. The flatline stuttered once, twice, and then, with the reluctance of something forced rather than invited, it resolved into a rhythm. Thin and slow and not yet reliable, but a rhythm. Elena stepped back from the bedside. Her hands were shaking slightly, which happened after sustained compressions and was simply physiology and not something she wasted attention on. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed out through her nose. "Sinus rhythm," Patel said. And her voice had something in it beyond relief, a quality Elena would think about later when she had time to think about anything. Elena looked at Merritt. He was already on his phone. He fired her in the corridor. Not in an office. Not with HR present or documentation or the professional courtesy of a closed door. He fired her in the hallway outside Bay 2 with a security officer beside him and 3 ministry representatives, still partially visible through the corridor glass. Because Douglas Merritt had decided in the 30 seconds between the patient's heart restarting and his call to security that the most important thing he could do in this moment was demonstrate that he was still the one with control. She unclipped her badge and held it out. He nodded to the security officer, who took it from her hand. "You'll be escorted to the locker room to collect your belongings. Any hospital equipment remains hospital property." She looked at him for a moment. She had the strange experience of feeling almost nothing. Not the hot rush of outrage she might have expected. Not the collapse she could feel waiting somewhere at the edges of her sternum. Just a cold clarity. The same clarity she'd learned to recognize from other situations in other places when things had gone irreversibly wrong, and the only useful response was to be completely present for what came next. "He needs to be monitored," she said. "His BP was still unstable when I stepped back. Someone needs to." "That's no longer your concern," Merritt said. She nodded, walked to the locker room, changed in silence. Collected the small number of things she kept in her locker, a spare elastic, a water bottle, a book she'd been carrying for 2 weeks without opening, and put them in the plastic bag the security officer held out. She didn't make it into anything. She didn't let it be a scene. In the parking lot, it was still February. The kind of February that Ontario produced without apology. Gray sky, cold that went through your jacket before you'd finished registering it. The particular compressed silence of a world under ice. Her truck was at the far end of the lot. The walk to it took 4 minutes. She spent them with her shoulders square and her pace deliberate, breaking the next 72 hours into a sequence of manageable tasks. Call the college. Check her certification status. Update her resume. Look at rural postings. She did not think about the man on the table. She knew that thinking about him was where she would lose it, so she stored him somewhere accessible for later and kept moving. Her truck started on the second try, which was good for February in Clearwater Bay. She sat in the cab with the defroster running, and her hands still in her lap and thought, okay, what's next? She was 5 kilometers from the hospital when her phone rang. Unknown number. Ontario prefix, but not one she placed. She almost didn't answer. The light ahead was red, and something about the area code made her pick up. Ms. Drake. Not a question. The voice was female, clipped, with the economy of someone accustomed to communicating in environments where wasted words had consequences. Who is this? My name is Warrant Officer Claire Tessier. I'm calling on behalf of individuals with a significant interest in the patient admitted to Northgate Regional at approximately 6:30 this morning. A pause. We understand you were involved in his resuscitation. Elena stared at the light. I was. And we understand you were subsequently removed from the facility. That's accurate, Ms. Drake. The pause that followed was different from the first one. Can you tell us his current condition as of when you last assessed? He had return of sinus rhythm. Pressure was unstable. I don't know anything past that. Understood. A third pause. Is there anything else you can tell us about his presentation? Anything that might inform our understanding of what happened to him? She thought about the boots, the calluses on his hands, the particular stillness of his unconscious face. Not the stillness of someone who had simply collapsed, but the trained stillness of someone whose body defaulted to composure even in its worst moments. Who are you calling on behalf of? She said. There was a sound she couldn't identify. Movement maybe, or someone else in the room adjusting position. Someone who will want to know you kept him alive, Tessier said. We'll be in touch. The line went dead. The light turned green. The car behind her tapped its horn and she drove. She spent the rest of the morning at her kitchen table with her laptop open to a job registry and her coffee going cold, staring at a blinking cursor and unable to make herself type. The apartment was small and organized in the particular way of someone who had learned early that everything needed a place and a purpose, because environments could turn fast, and you needed to be able to find things. A corkboard above the desk with her recertification schedule. A window that looked onto a street where the snow was coming down again, soft and relentless. Her phone buzzed twice. Both from colleagues at Northgate, careful texts that were clearly written by people thinking about HR. The third message was from Dr. Patel, and it said only, "He's stable. I see you." And then, a minute later, for what it's worth. She stared at those 4 words for longer than she'd like to admit. She was making her second attempt at actually searching for open positions when a local news alert came through. She had a Northgate alert set up from months back, after a story about equipment procurement had broken in the regional paper. The alert now was different. Clearwater Bay Courier. The headline was a single blunt mine. Man found on Highway 26 admitted to Northgate Regional. Police sources. Possible military connection. She read it twice. Called Tessier's number. 4 rings. No answer. She put the phone face down on the table and looked at the snow. Whatever was coming, from Merit, from her employment status, from the phone call, it was already in motion. She could feel it the way you felt, a storm system before it arrived. A change in pressure rather than anything you could point to. She called Dr. Patel instead. He picked up on the first ring. I saw the alert, she said. Yeah, his voice was careful. Do you know more than what they printed? Not officially. A pause that told her he did. Cassidy, he stopped. Elena, sorry, long shift. He cleared his throat. They found something in his boot, not a wallet, something else. What kind of something? But Patel had already gone further than he planned to, and she could hear him pulling back. Don't go anywhere, he said. I think things are going to move. He hung up. The call she'd been waiting for came at 11:43 that night. Not from Tessier. A Toronto area code. Male voice, economic to the point of efficiency, the kind of communication style developed in environments where context was assumed rather than supplied. Ms. Drake, my name is Captain Roy Levine. I'm calling on behalf of Colonel Bielyu's command. I understand you were the primary responder this morning. She was on her couch in the dark. She'd been attempting sleep for 2 hours and had achieved approximately none of it. Colonel Bielyu, she repeated. The patient admitted to Northgate Regional at 0630. I can't give you more than the name right now. Is he alive? A beat. He's stable as of 2 hours ago. ICU team upgraded his status to guarded. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. We need to understand something, Levine continued. The attending physician listed you as primary on the resuscitation report, but you were removed from the facility before that report was filed. That creates a documentation issue. It creates more than that, Elena said. We're aware. We're also aware of the circumstances of your removal. We've spoken with staff members at Northgate in the last 6 hours. We have a detailed picture of what happened in that bay. Beat. What I need from you directly. Are you willing to make a formal statement about what the CFO ordered you to do while the patient was in cardiac arrest? She looked at the window. The snow had stopped sometime around 9. The street was quiet and white and still. Yes, she said, I'm willing. Good. Someone will contact you tomorrow with the time and location. Try to sleep. He hung up. She didn't sleep. The location was a federal health oversight office on a commercial block in downtown Clearwater Bay, a building she had driven past regularly for 4 years and never looked at directly. She arrived at 8:52 for a 9 o'clock meeting. Captain Levine in person was mid-30s, precise in the way of someone who had learned economy as a survival skill. He had a woman with him, Sergeant Bertrand, and a civilian from the Provincial College of Paramedics named Dr. Okafor, who said little, but wrote everything down. They asked her to walk through the morning from the beginning. She did. She was specific about times, about clinical observations, about what was said and by whom and in what sequence. When she reached the point where Merritt said, I understand the clinical risk, Okafor stopped writing for a second, just a second, then continued. He used those exact words, Levine said. Those exact words? And then he physically made contact with you. He put his hand on my shoulder and attempted to pull me back from the bedside. And your response? I removed his hand and resumed compressions. Dr. Okafor looked up over his reading glasses. That's a significant response to a senior executive. He's not my superior in a clinical setting, Elena said. And physically pulling an emergency responder away from an active resuscitation is interference with emergency care. I responded to the interference. Okafor wrote something down. She couldn't read it and didn't try. The interview lasted 2 hours and 6 minutes. Levine walked her to the lobby at the end and said, What you did in that bay is not what's being examined here. What happened to you afterward is. She looked at him. What does that mean, practically? It means we're not finished, he said. And it means you should hold off on accepting other employment until you hear from us. She drove home with that sitting in her chest like a piece of ice that wouldn't quite dissolve. The story broke on the second day. Not the full story, but enough. The Courier ran a piece at noon. Northgate paramedic fired after saving unidentified patient, sources say. It was careful and accurate. It named Merritt by title. The comments were what comments always were. A mix of outrage and people with opinions about hospital administration formed from no particular experience. But the piece itself held. By 4 in the afternoon, 2 regional TV stations had picked it up. By 6, a health workers' advocacy account with 60,000 followers had shared it with a single caption. A man's heart restarted. A paramedic got fired. The CFO kept his job. Elena found out through a text from her friend Sophie, who worked in health policy in Ottawa, and had a habit of sending links without context and then calling immediately after. Your name isn't in it, Sophie said when she picked up. I know, but it's clearly you. Do you have a lawyer? She didn't. She wrote it down. She was 3 names deep into searching for employment lawyers who handled healthcare cases when a Northgate internal communication was forwarded to her from a current staff address. She recognized the sender, a young ER tech named Jordan Sue, who she'd mentored for 6 months, and who had apparently decided that whatever HR might do to him was worth it. The communication was from Merritt. Subject line: addressing external inquiries. It described her termination as the result of insubordination and breach of conduct protocols. It framed his presence in the bay as executive oversight during a high-acuity patient event. It said the hospital was cooperating fully with any relevant regulatory review in a way that made cooperation sound like it had been their idea. It did not mention the cardiac arrest. It did not mention what the patient's status had been when Elena arrived at the bedside, or what it was when the security officer walked her to her locker. She forwarded it to Levine's number with no message. He responded in 9 minutes, received "thank you," and then 4 minutes later, "don't speak to press yet, we're close." She put the phone down and looked at the ceiling. Close was not a phrase that helped her sleep. The black vehicles arrived at Northgate Regional at 7:50 the following morning. She found out from Jordan, who sent a single text: "Military people here, a lot of them. Conference room upstairs, what is happening?" She called Patel. He picked up immediately. "How many?" she said. 4 vehicles. At least 6 personnel. One of them is a colonel. I saw the insignia." He paused. "They went to the executive wing. Merritt's been in there for 25 minutes. She sat on the edge of her bed. "Raymond, is Beaulieu still in ICU?" "Still there. The colonel went up first, actually. Spent 15 minutes in the room before going upstairs." She thought about that. A senior officer visiting a patient before going to confront the CFO who had tried to interrupt his resuscitation. The sequence was deliberate. The sequence was a message. "Who is the colonel?" she said. Staff looked up the insignia. Patel's voice was careful. "Colonel Marie-France Dubois. She oversees operational medicine for the Joint Task Force in this region." Something settled in Elena's chest that she couldn't name precisely. Not relief. Too early. Not satisfaction. That word didn't fit. Something closer to the recognition of a system doing what systems were supposed to do, which happened rarely enough that she'd stopped taking it for granted. Patel's voice dropped. "Elena, I was 6 feet away when you told him what the clinical consequence of stopping was. I didn't do enough in that moment. I've been thinking about that." "You had your hands on the patient," she said. "That's what I keep telling myself." "It's also true. It was your call to make, and you made the right one." A long silence. "You're a strange person," he said. But it wasn't an insult. She knew. He hung up. She was still working out what to do with the morning when her doorbell rang. She went to the door the way she went to all things that required caution in uncertain circumstances, carefully, without performance. She looked through the peephole and saw a woman in dress uniform standing on her front step with the posture of someone who had spent a long time in environments where posture communicated things that words couldn't. She opened the door. The woman was in her late 40s, compact and still, with a kind of face that had done considerable work and bore the evidence of it without apology. The rank insignia confirmed what Patel had said. "Ms. Drake," said Colonel Marie-France Dubois, "I'd like to talk." Elena looked at her, at the uniform, at the 2 vehicles parked at the curb she hadn't noticed until this moment. "Come in," she said. She led her to the kitchen table. "Offered coffee because it was what you did." Dubois accepted with a single nod, and they sat across from each other in the pale winter light while Elena poured and tried to read a face that had been trained over decades not to be readable. "Colonel Beaulieu is going to recover," Dubois said before Elena had sat down. "Fully, as far as his physicians can tell. The damage was manageable because of what you did. I did my job." "You did considerably more than that." Dubois wrapped both hands around the mug. Her hands were scarred across the knuckles in a way that Elena noted without comment. "You did it after being ordered to stop by the senior executive of the facility. Stopping would have been the more serious choice." Dubois looked at her steadily. "I've spent the last 2 days reading your file. Your employment record here. Your work with the fly-in response program before that." She paused. 14 communities in 2.5 years. Conditions that most Southern responders would have requested equipment upgrades before entering. "I made it work with what was there." "I know you did." Another pause. "You left that program voluntarily?" Elena looked at the window. The snow had started again, fine and directionless, the kind that accumulated without announcing itself. Yes. Why? It wasn't a question she answered frequently, not because the answer was still sharp. It had been years, and sharp had become something more like a scar, present but no longer open. But because the full version of it required trust, she didn't distribute casually. She looked at Dubois across the kitchen table and decided this was a context that warranted it. There was a situation, she said, toward the end of my second year. A patient we couldn't save. Not because of anything clinical. Because of a transport prioritization decision made at a level above mine that directed resources somewhere else. Someone ran the numbers and made a call, and they were wrong, and I didn't handle how I responded to that well. I stayed for another 8 months, but I was done before I left. Dubois listened to all of it without moving. Was it documented? She asked. In a way that was not entirely favorable to me. And yet your Northgate record is without a single complaint. People change when the context changes, Elena said. Or they find a context that fits. Dubois nodded slowly. Then she set down the mug and the quality of her attention shifted, not less focused, but wider. The way a lens adjusted from close to broader range. I'm going to tell you something that isn't public yet, she said. I'm telling you because you're owed it. She met Elena's eyes. Douglas Merritt's conduct in that bay is under formal review by the Provincial College of Healthcare Executives and the Ministry's Patient Safety Division. We accelerated that process. The hospital board has been notified. Elena wrapped her hands around her mug. There's also the surveillance footage, Dubois continued. The bay has a camera. Standard protocol. It captured everything from Merritt's entry to your removal, including the physical contact, including what he said. The kitchen was very quiet. He said it on camera, Elena said. Every word. She thought about Merritt in that room. The delegation in the corridor. His perfectly calibrated voice saying, I understand the clinical risk. The particular confidence of a man who had never in his life been the one on the table. What happens next? She said. That depends partly on what you want, Dubois said. Elena opened her mouth. Her phone lit up on the table. Jordan's name on the screen. The message beneath it was 3 words and capitalized. Merritt called security. Then 3 seconds later, on the board, she showed Dubois the phone. The colonel read both messages, set the phone back on the table with the deliberate calm of someone who had learned long ago that the first response to unexpected information was rarely the most useful one, and stood up. Where's your coat? She said. They were in the first vehicle in under 5 minutes. Elena sat in the back beside Dubois and watched Clearwater Bay move past the windows as the driver threaded through morning traffic on King Street toward the hospital with the unhurried confidence of someone who didn't need to announce their authority over the road. Nobody in the car spoke, which Elena appreciated because she was thinking. Merritt calling security on his own board members meant he had run out of the moves that required subtlety. A CFO managing his position from strength negotiated. He called lawyers. He arranged careful conversations and bought time. Calling security on the people who held his contract meant the internal calculation had already collapsed, and what was left was force blunt and reflexive and almost always self-defeating. It also meant the board had arrived without warning, which meant someone had arranged that. She looked at Dubois. The colonel was looking straight ahead. You called the board, Elena said. The Oversight Division made certain information available to individuals with fiduciary responsibility for the institution. That's a careful way to say yes. The corner of Dubois' mouth moved, almost imperceptibly. It's an accurate way to say yes. The lobby at Northgate was not dramatic. No raised voices. Nothing that would have looked like anything to a patient family crossing toward the elevator. But to someone who knew what to look for, it was visible in the way the reception staff were standing slightly too straight, in the way the security officers near the main desk weren't making eye contact with anyone, in the way the hospital was holding its breath. Dubois walked through the lobby with 3 personnel behind her. Elena walked beside her, which she suspected was deliberate. Dubois could have had her wait in the vehicle. They took the elevator to the 4th floor. The executive suite occupied the east wing. glass-walled meeting rooms, a reception area with furniture that had clearly been chosen for a brochure. At the far end, behind a set of heavy doors, Merritt's office. The doors were open. Inside the conference room, Elena counted 8 people. 4 she didn't recognize, board members from the particular look of people accustomed to authority encountering a problem outside their usual range. One was Dr. Koppel, Fatima Osei, the hospital's chief medical officer, who Elena had met twice and both times had come away thinking, very sharp, very careful about when she shows it. One was the hospital's legal counsel, Beaumont, already standing when they entered. One was a provincial patient safety investigator whose name Elena didn't yet know. And at the head of the table, still in his press shirt, still wearing the composed certainty that Elena was beginning to understand was his only consistent feature, was Douglas Merritt. He saw Elena before he saw Dubois. Something crossed his face briefly. Not fear. More like the recalibration of a man who had just realized the geometry of the room was not what he'd prepared for. Then he saw the uniform. Colonel Dubois. His voice was professionally even. I wasn't expecting. I'm here on behalf of Colonel Beaulieu's command, Dubois said, and I have information that I'd like everyone present to hear. Beaumont cleared his throat. Colonel, any communication related to pending regulatory matters should be directed through legal counsel. Dubois didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Sit down. He sat down. The board chair, a woman in her 60s named Sandra Ellsworth, with the composed manner of someone who governed large things professionally, looked from Dubois to Merritt and back. Colonel, I'm Sandra Ellsworth, board chair. We were in the middle of a governance conversation when Mr. Merritt called building security on the people who hold his contract. I'm aware of that, Dubois said. She set a folder on the table. This is a summary document from the Federal Health Oversight Review. It covers the events of this past Tuesday from 6:30 to 7:15 a.m. in Trauma Bay 2. It includes timestamps, clinical records, and a transcript of the surveillance footage from that room. She paused. I'll give everyone a moment. The room went quiet in the particular way of a room where several people are reading something they didn't expect to read. Ellsworth read carefully with the focused attention of someone building an argument in real time. A board member Elena didn't recognize, a heavy-set man in his 50s, stopped on what appeared to be the transcript page. He read something. Read it again, then looked up at Merritt with an expression that wasn't anger. It was something worse than anger. It was the look of a person realizing they had been represented by someone they did not know. Douglas, he said, did you say this? Merritt's jaw tightened. That's taken out of context. It's a direct transcript. There was a clinical situation being managed in a way that... It's a transcript, the man said again, of you telling a paramedic to stop CPR because provincial ministry staff were watching. Is that what happened? The silence that followed had weight. Dr. Osei closed her folder. Elena Drake's protocol adherence during that resuscitation was textbook. Every intervention was within scope. The rib stress fracture was an expected outcome of effective compressions on a large adult patient. His return to sinus rhythm happened because of her actions. She looked at Merritt directly. Not despite what you did. Because of what she refused to stop doing. Merritt turned to Beaumont, which was the move of a man who had exhausted his other options. Beaumont was already writing something and did not look up. Elena had not expected to be in that room. She had not arranged any of this, had not asked for it. She was there entirely because a woman in uniform had said, "Where's your coat?" and moved fast. And she was aware, standing near that doorway, that she was doing something she didn't entirely have a handle on, which was feeling, not managing her expression, not calibrating her response, but actually feeling the accumulated weight of the previous 4 days pressing against the place behind her sternum she'd been keeping locked since the parking lot. She kept her face still. She was good at that. Her hands at her sides were not entirely steady, and she noticed that without apology. Merritt was talking again. He'd shifted registers. The executive composure was developing cracks, and what was coming through was rawer and less managed. He was talking about liability, about provincial funding environments, about the pressures facing mid-sized regional health facilities. The words described real pressures, but the context he was applying them to was so catastrophically wrong that every sentence made things worse. The decision I made in that room, he said, was a risk management decision. I assessed the clinical situation against broader institutional priorities and— You told her to let him die, Ellsworth said, flat, no inflection. The room went still again. That is the precise clinical consequence of stopping CPR on a patient in ventricular fibrillation without an established alternative intervention. Ellsworth closed her folder. I've sat on 3 hospital boards. I have never in any context seen documentation that looks like this. She looked at Elena for the first time since they'd entered the room. It was a direct, assessing look. Ms. Drake, you were terminated the morning of this patient's admission. I was. While he was still in critical condition in the adjacent bay. Yes. Ellsworth looked back at Merritt. Something in her face had resolved. The particular stillness of someone who had been waiting for confirmation before drawing a conclusion, and had now received it. Douglas, she said, I need you to step out. The hallway outside the conference room had the antiseptic quiet of administrative spaces rarely used for anything urgent. Merritt walked out ahead of his legal counsel and did not look at Elena as he passed, which was a choice she recognized as conscious, the last form of control available to him in that moment. She watched him go. Dubois came out of the conference room 2 minutes later and stood beside her. Ellsworth is calling an emergency board session, she said. Board only. How long? Depends on what they already know going in. Dubois glanced sideways at her. They knew a fair amount going in. Elena nodded slowly. What about Beaulieu? He's been asking about you. Since yesterday morning. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected gratitude through channels, official and at a careful distance. Not this. He's been awake enough to be asking questions, Dubois said. His team considers that a good sign. He's not an easy patient, I'm told. Most of the ones we're saving aren't, Elena said. Dubois looked at her with the steady, building quality of someone assembling an understanding from available evidence. When this is resolved, she said, and it will be resolved today, there's going to be a conversation about what comes next for you. I want you to think about what you actually want, not what seems most practical. Elena started to answer. Don't answer now, Dubois said. Think. They put her in a side room with a chair, a window, and another bad cup of coffee while the board session ran. Levine came by twice with compressed updates. The session was running long. Difficulty or thoroughness, probably both. Merritt had requested to address the board directly. The board had declined. His counsel had submitted a written statement. The board had received it with the attention of people looking for inconsistencies. At 20 past noon, Dr. Osei appeared in the doorway. She looked tired in the cumulative way, not just from the morning, but from longer than that. She sat down across from Elena and set a tablet on her knee and was quiet for a moment. I owe you an apology, she said. For what? I was aware before Tuesday that Merritt's management approach in clinical situations was a problem. There had been incidents, smaller ones, choices that compromised patient care in ways that were deniable. She looked at the tablet. I documented them. I didn't escalate them. I told myself I was managing the situation by staying close to it. What I was actually doing was making a peace I shouldn't have made. Elena thought about what to say to that. Why are you telling me now? Because I testified to it this morning, Osei said, to the board and to the regulatory reviewers. And I need you to know that before you hear it from somewhere else. Also, she met Elena's eyes. Because you were one of the best clinicians in this department, and you were walked out to the parking lot for doing your job without a single error, and I watched it happen, and I didn't stop it. You had your hands on the patient. That's the same thing Dr. Patel said. We had a similar vantage point. She looked at the window. Outside, the sky had the low white quality of a day still deciding whether it was finished with snow. The board is going to vote in the next hour, Osei said. I've been asked to provide a clinical recommendation on trauma staffing, which is a careful way of asking whether I think you should come back. She paused. I told them the unit's acute stabilization rate has dropped since Tuesday, which is statistically significant for a department this size in a 4-day window. I also told them that if they were serious about the expanded regional trauma program that's been on the strategic plan for 3 years and keeps getting deferred, they needed someone with the clinical authority and operational instinct to actually build it. The sentence landed and stayed there. That's not a floor position, Elena said. No, OC said, it's not. Elena looked at her. I've been a field paramedic. You've been a field paramedic who functioned as an informal department anchor every time the formal structure under-delivered. I've watched you for 2 years. Merritt never did, but I did. OC stood up. Don't decide anything yet. The board has to vote first. But I wanted you to know what's been said. She left. Elena sat with her cold coffee and tried to hold all of the moving pieces in some kind of order, and mostly failed. She thought about the man on the gurney at 6:30 in the morning. Blue from the cold, no identification. Nobody in that room knowing yet who he was or what the radius of consequence would be from the decision she made in the next 30 seconds. She hadn't known any of it. She'd known his pressure was crashing and his heart had stopped, and she knew how to keep blood moving. The rest of it, the board session, the oversight review, the colonel at her kitchen table, all of it was downstream from that one decision, which had not been complicated. It had been the only option available, and she had taken it, and the complexity was everything that came after. Her phone lit up. A Northgate exchange she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was low and slightly hoarse in the way of someone whose medication hadn't fully worn off yet, and it said, "Is this the paramedic who cracked my ribs?" She closed her eyes briefly. "Colonel Beaulieu," she said. "I've been trying to get someone to give me your number for a day and a half. I'm not technically on staff at the moment. I know that. I know all of it now." A pause and the sound of movement that suggested he was attempting to sit up. "There's something I want to say." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I'm saying it anyway." His voice steadied slightly, like he'd found a position that didn't cost him. "I've been in situations where someone made a call that kept me alive and I never got to say I knew what it cost them. I don't want to do that again." She was quiet for a moment. "Are you in pain?" "Significant, yes." "Is someone monitoring you right now?" "There's a very tired-looking ICU nurse in the doorway, who I believe is keeping a running list of complaints about me. That's her job." "I'm aware." A sound that converted at the last moment from something like a laugh into something more careful. "Are you coming back to this hospital?" "I don't know yet." "You should," he said, "for whatever that's worth, from the person whose ribs you cracked. It's worth something. Rest. Stop trying to sit up." "How did you?" "Because I can hear it in your voice." She paused. "Lie down, Colonel." A brief silence. "Yes, ma'am." She ended the call and sat with the phone in her hand and felt, for the first time in 4 days, something that was close to solid ground. The board session ended at 1:53. She knew because Dubois appeared in the doorway at 2:01 with Ellsworth behind her, and Ellsworth walked in with the direct, contained energy of someone delivering a verdict. She sat down across from Elena. Dubois remained standing near the door. "The board has voted on 3 resolutions in the last 90 minutes, Ellsworth said. "I want to walk you through them." Elena nodded. "First," Ellsworth folded her hands on the table. "Douglas Merritt's contract as CFO of Northgate Regional Health Centre has been terminated effective immediately for conduct that directly endangered patient welfare and for actions incompatible with the executive responsibilities of this institution. He's been asked to vacate the executive suite by end of business today." The words dropped into the room with a weight Elena felt physically. Not triumph. Not the clean satisfaction the story wanted her to feel. Something more complicated. The acknowledgement that something real had happened and that someone was being held responsible for it. Second, Ellsworth continued, the board has formally requested that the provincial patient safety review include a full audit of executive interference in clinical operations over the past 24 months. Dr. Osei has provided documentation from her records. 3 other physicians have come forward with relevant incidents. Elena looked at her. 3 others. It wasn't the first time, Ellsworth said. And her voice had an edge that was directed somewhere Elena wasn't. This board should have known sooner. We didn't. That's a problem we will address internally. She paused. When she spoke again, something in her manner shifted. Not softer, but more deliberate. Third resolution. Your termination on Tuesday morning has been classified as wrongful dismissal under the Ontario Health System Workers Protection Act. You're entitled to full reinstatement with back pay and a formal apology entered into the institutional record. Elena looked at the table. There's more, Ellsworth said. Dr. Ose has proposed a restructured regional trauma partnership directorship. The board has provisionally approved the framework. She met Elena's eyes. Ose recommended you specifically. So did Captain Levine's office, on the basis of your service record and clinical performance. She paused. This is not being offered out of obligation or optics. It's being offered because the people who understand this department believe you're the right person for it, and because what happened 4 days ago exposed a structural failure that requires more than a personnel change at the top. Elena was quiet for a long moment. I don't need time, she said. Ellsworth waited. But I have conditions. A flicker of something in Ellsworth's expression. Surprise. Then the rapid upward revision of someone adjusting an assessment. Tell me, Ellsworth said. The trauma unit's equipment requests have been deferred for 2.5 years. I have a list. That list gets reviewed and actioned before I sign anything. She kept her voice level. The ER's been running understaffed since last spring. That gets addressed structurally, not through individual schedule manipulation. And I want Dr. Patel's role formalized. He's been functioning as de facto clinical lead with a title that doesn't reflect it, and that gets corrected. Ellsworth was writing. Anything else? Not today, Elena said, but I'll have more. Ellsworth looked up from her notes, and for the first time since she'd walked into the room, she smiled. Brief and genuine and faintly rueful, the smile of someone recognizing something they'd underestimated. I expect you will, she said. She went to see Beaulieu at 3 o'clock. Dubois had cleared it, which was apparently something Dubois could arrange. The ICU charge nurse walked her to the room with the resigned efficiency of someone who had spent 3 days managing an unusual number of people in uniform, asking about one specific patient and had reached a pragmatic peace with the situation. The room was small and institutional, and full of monitors and the particular smell that ICUs had underneath the antiseptic. The smell you learned to stop consciously noticing because noticing it continuously was not compatible with functioning in the space. Beaulieu was propped up at an angle that represented the negotiated position between what he wanted and what his medical team had approved. He was larger than she'd registered in the bay, broad to the shoulders, mid-50s, with the kind of face that had been weathered by something more specific than age. A bruise along his left jaw. Sutured laceration work above his temple. He looked at her when she came in. You're younger than I expected, he said. You're more intact than I expected, she said. He made a sound that was more pain than amusement. Sit down, please. You standing there is making me feel like I should be doing something formal. She pulled the chair close to the bed and sat. For a moment, neither of them said anything, which was fine. She'd spent enough time in medical spaces to know that silence wasn't always absence of communication. I don't remember much before I went under, he said. Cold. The road. 30 seconds in the ambulance. He looked at the ceiling. I remember a voice saying he's going into VF in the tone that told me that was bad. Then nothing until I woke up here with 8 people staring at me and my chest feeling like I'd argued with a transport truck. The compressions. I know. He looked at her. I've seen CPR performed. I understand what effective compressions require. He paused. I'm told you were ordered to stop. Yes. And you didn't. No. He was quiet for a moment. Whatever he was thinking moved across his face in a way that was controlled but not entirely hidden. The quality of a man who was unaccustomed to being in a position of obligation and was working out what to do with it. I've been trying to figure out what to say to you, he said. Everything sounds inadequate. Then don't try to make it adequate. Just say what's true. He looked at her. A recognition of someone who communicated the same way he did. "Thank you," he said, "for not stopping." She nodded once. "Once you were my patient, I was responsible for you. Dubois told me you said that." He looked at his hands resting on the blanket with the stillness of someone managing pain. "She also told me what it cost you." "It cost me 4 days," Elena said. "I'll survive 4 days." "It cost you more than that." She didn't answer. Not because it wasn't true. It was, and the cost had been real in ways she was still working through. But because it wasn't the part that mattered most right now, and she wasn't going to let it become the center of the story. "Are you taking the directorship?" he said. "You know about that." "Dubois briefs me." He paused. "She also tells me the formal investigation into your termination is continuing. There may be additional steps requiring your involvement." She nodded. "You okay with that?" "Yes." He watched her for a moment. "When I was told everything that had happened, not just the medical piece, but the rest of it, my first response was anger." He said it plainly, reporting data. "Someone used your situation against you. I don't like that." "The system eventually worked," she said. "After it failed, you first." She didn't dispute it. "After it failed me first," she agreed. He seemed to appreciate that. He shifted in the bed, and the monitor registered it and settled again. "Get some rest," she said, standing. "Your ribs will hurt more tomorrow when the swaying peaks." "I'm aware of the biology." "I know. I'm saying it anyway." She was at the door when he said her name. Not Ms. Drake, not the title, just her first name. She turned. "Whatever they offer you," he said, "ask for more. You earned it." She looked at him in the pale light of the ICU room, propped against hospital pillows with bruises on his jaw and monitors on his chest. He looked like what he was, a person who had been very close to the edge of something and come back from it, and who was working out what that meant. "I already did," she said. She walked back down the corridor toward the elevator. The hallway was empty and quiet and ordinary in the way hospital hallways were always ordinary, except when they weren't. She pressed the call button and waited and listened to the building breathe around her. The monitors, the distant PA system, the sustained hum of a place that never fully stopped. The elevator opened. Inside it, looking straight ahead, was Douglas Merritt. He had his coat on, a cardboard box under one arm. His badge was already gone from his lapel. Neither of them moved for a second. Then Merritt stepped forward to exit, and Elena stepped back to let him pass. And for one brief window, they were 3 feet apart in the corridor outside the ICU. The man who had taken her badge and told building security to walk her out into the February cold. And the woman he had decided was replaceable. He didn't look at her. She didn't look away from him. He walked past her toward the exit. His shoes made the particular sound of someone doing everything he could to look like he was walking somewhere rather than away from something. She watched him go without moving. Then she turned back to the elevator, pressed the lobby button, and as the door slid shut, she pulled out her phone and called Ellsworth's number. Ellsworth picked up on the second ring. "I'm in," Elena said, "but I need that equipment list reviewed before end of week. I'll have the procurement committee on a call by Friday morning." "Good." She paused. "One more thing. Jordan Sue, the ER tech who forwarded me the internal communication. He took a risk doing that, and I don't want it held against him." A moment of silence on the other end. "That's already been handled," Ellsworth said. "We're not in the business of penalizing people for transparency. Not anymore." The elevator doors opened on the lobby floor. Elena stepped out into the wide fluorescent space. The reception desk. The visitors moving through the ordinary specific reality of a hospital functioning at capacity on a February afternoon. She was halfway to the main exit when something on her left stopped her cold. Near the corridor that led to the administrative wing, a cluster of 3 people she didn't recognize, civilian clothes, moving with the purposeful quiet of people trying not to draw attention and drawing it anyway. One carrying a hard case the size of a carry-on, moving not toward any patient area, not toward administration, but toward the service corridor that connected the main building to the north annex. She went very still. One of them glanced up for a second. Their eyes met hers. Moved on. That specific non-look. She knew it from other contexts in other places, and it landed in her chest like something cold. She pulled out her phone. Called Devine. No answer. Called Dubois. 4 rings. 5. On the 5th, Dubois picked up. Before Elena could speak, Dubois said, "Where are you right now?" Lobby, main building. 3 people moving toward the North Annex Service Corridor. Do not follow them. Dubois's voice had changed entirely. Walk to the main exit. There's a vehicle at the curb. Black. Get in and stay there. What's in the north? Elena. Her first name, deliberate. Move now. She was already moving. Behind her, somewhere in the corridor she'd been watching, she heard a service door open and close, and then from somewhere deeper in the building, not loud, not cinematic, just wrong in the way that sounds were wrong when they came from where they shouldn't. A single electronic tone. The kind that meant something on the hospital's network had just gone offline. She made it to the main exit in 38 seconds. The black vehicle was exactly where Dubois had said, idling at the curb with a driver who unlocked the door before she reached the handle. She got in. The door closed. The lobby disappeared behind tinted glass. She called Dubois again. 1 ring. Are you in the vehicle? Dubois said. Yes. What's in the North Annex? A pause. Not the pause of someone who didn't know. Hospital data infrastructure, network routing. The server cluster that manages electronic patient records, billing, and Dubois stopped. Monitoring integration, Elena said. Yes. ICU monitoring integration. Yes. The word landed like something physical. We're already moving. Stay in the vehicle. I mean that. If someone takes the monitoring system offline while BOU is... Elena, I have people inside. Stay put. The line stayed open, but Dubois stopped talking, and Elena sat in the back of the vehicle with the phone against her ear and listened to the sound of someone doing something urgent at a distance. Movement. A voice she couldn't parse. The city outside the tinted glass going about its ordinary afternoon business. 4 minutes passed. We have them, Dubois said. All 3. North Annex, First Junction. They hadn't reached the server room. Elena pressed her fingers against her knee. They had network intrusion equipment. The case contained signal jammers and a hardware tap device. Dubois paused. The timing relative to Merritt's termination is not something anyone is treating as coincidental. She thought about Merritt and the elevator. The box. The badge already gone. The 3 people in the lobby maybe 4 minutes after that. He made a call, Elena said. That's the hypothesis we're currently working with. They brought her back inside at 2:20. Levine had set up in one of the hospital's smaller conference rooms with a digital recorder and the organized focus of someone who had shifted into a different operational mode entirely. He looked at her when she walked in. Walk me through exactly what you saw in the lobby, he said. Start with where you were standing. She did. She was precise about angles, sightlines, timing, the quality of the eye contact that hadn't been eye contact. Levine recorded it. Asked 3 follow-up questions, wrote 2 things down. Then he looked at her across the table. The 3 individuals are in federal custody pending identification, he said. We found communications on one of the devices. Encrypted, but not well. And he folded his hands. Merritt has been detained for questioning. He hasn't been charged, but he's not going home tonight. The word detained sat in the air differently than all the other words that had been in that room. She hadn't expected the speed of it. Not because she thought Merritt didn't deserve it. She had stopped having opinions about what Merritt deserved, somewhere around hour 36 of the week, when the energy required to sustain outrage had simply run out and left something colder and more durable in its place. But the speed of it caught her off guard, because 3 days ago she'd been in a parking lot in February with a plastic bag and a dread she'd managed by converting it into task lists. Does Beaulieu know? She said. He's been briefed. Levine's voice had a quality of careful restraint. His exact response isn't in the official record, but his team described it as colorful. Levine began packing the recorder. What you spotted in the lobby may be significant to establishing when the intrusion attempt began, he said. You may be asked to provide a formal witness statement. I'm willing. I know. He clicked the recorder case shut and looked at her once more with something that wasn't quite warmth, but was the particular regard of someone who had revised an initial assessment and was acknowledging it without making a production of it. "You've had a long 4 days, Ms. Drake." "Yes," she said, "I have." The news broke publicly at 6 that evening. Regional television, clearly working a source inside the hospital, careful in the way that journalists were careful when they knew more than they were legally comfortable saying. The framework was accurate. The termination. The oversight review. The federal involvement. The Chiron read, Northgate Regional CFO fired, detained for questioning following patient safety incident and alleged network breach. Elena watched the first 2 minutes on her phone in the hospital cafeteria, where she'd ended up after Levine's debrief, eating a sandwich she was actually eating because she hadn't eaten properly in 4 days, and her body had been registering the complaint for the last 6 hours. She turned it off after 2 minutes. Not because she was indifferent to it, she wasn't, but because watching it felt like something she needed to do privately later, when she could actually process it. Sophie texted at 6:12. "Are you watching this?" Then 30 seconds later, Elena, "What did you do?" "I spotted some people in the lobby." Elena texted back. "I'll explain later," she sent before Sophie could respond. She finished the sandwich. Got a second coffee because the day was showing no sign of ending and she had stopped pretending otherwise. She was staring at nothing in particular, thinking about the equipment list she needed to compile before Friday, when someone sat down across from her without asking. Dr. Osei, still in her white coat, which meant she'd come straight from somewhere clinical. The look of someone running on professional duty rather than anything physiological. She put a folder on the table. "What's that?" Elena said. "The structural review on the trauma unit that's been sitting in Merritt's inbox since September." Osei pushed it across the table. He never responded. The departments that submitted it assumed it was being reviewed. She paused. It was not being reviewed. Elena opened it, scanned the first page. The language was administrative, but the numbers told a clear story. Equipment deferrals totaling $280,000. Staffing gaps documented across 8 months. A formal request for 3 additional senior paramedic RN cross-trained staff that had been submitted and then submitted again 5 months later with no response. "Who wrote this?" she said. "Mostly in Jordan Sioux," Osei said. "With input from 4 other senior staff, it took them 7 weeks." Elena looked at the document for a moment, at the careful, detailed work of people who had done everything right. Documented the problems, run the numbers, gone through the proper channels, and been met with administrative silence while the man responsible for that silence spent operational budget on the provincial delegation hospitality package. "I want a copy sent to Ellsworth today," Elena said, "and Jordan's name on the record as primary author." "Already done on both counts." Osei looked at her. 3 more staff have come forward since this afternoon. Different incidents, different dates. A physician in cardiology is preparing a statement about a resource allocation decision last winter that he believes contributed to an adverse outcome. She paused. It's becoming a larger picture than just Tuesday. Elena had expected as much. What Merritt had done in that bay wasn't the decision of a man who had never done anything like it before. It was the decision of a man who had been allowed to make smaller versions of it. Enough times that his judgment about what was permissible had drifted somewhere very far from where it needed to be. "The regulatory review will capture all of it," Elena said. "It will." Osei stood up. "Get some sleep tonight. Tomorrow is going to be complicated." "More or less complicated than today?" Osei considered this with genuine seriousness. Different kind of complicated. Today was crisis. Tomorrow is reconstruction. She picked up her coffee cup. "You're better at crisis. So am I. The reconstruction is harder." She left. Elena sat with the folder and the sounds of the cafeteria around her and thought about reconstruction. She was almost at the parking lot when Levine called. "We have a partial match on one of the 3 individuals from the lobby," he said. "Private contractor, defense sector. His file is interesting." "Interesting how?" "He appears on a consulting roster for a healthcare infrastructure advisory firm That also appears on the list of investment groups attending Merit's provincial delegation tour on Tuesday morning. She stopped walking. He was in the hospital on Tuesday, she said. We believe so. We're pulling lobby footage. Levine's voice had a quality of restraint in it, the sound of someone carrying something heavier than they were showing, if the connection holds. And I want to be clear, we're still verifying. It suggests the events of Tuesday were not purely about optics. That Merit's behavior in the Bay may have been partly about controlling who was present and what information was accessible while BU was an unidentified patient. They didn't know who he was when he came in, Elena said slowly. But someone in that delegation may have, Levine said. That's the question we're currently working. Don't repeat that. I won't. One more thing. He paused. Merit's personal phone records from Tuesday show 9 outgoing calls between 6 and 8 a.m. We have records of 7. We're working on the other 2. One of the 2 we can't yet account for was placed at 6:21. She ran the timeline she'd been carrying in her head for 4 days. 6:21 was 7 minutes after the ambulance bay doors opened. 2 minutes after Merit walked into Bay 2. 3 minutes before he ordered her to stop compressions. He called someone while he was in the room, she said. We don't know that for certain. But that's what you're looking at. Levine didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. Get some rest, he said. I'll be in touch tomorrow. She got in her truck. The engine started on the first try, which felt like a small mercy. She drove out of the Northgate parking lot onto King Street and thought about a man making a phone call in a trauma bay while someone's heart had stopped, while her hands were doing the only thing available to keep him alive, while, 7 minutes away, people in civilian clothes were already on their way to a hospital with a hard case full of equipment designed to tap silently into a medical network. The snow had started again, fine and directionless, the kind that accumulated without announcing itself. She drove home through it. Her apartment was exactly as she'd left it. The corkboard, the recertification schedule, the window, the kitchen table where a colonel had sat and drank her coffee 2 days ago. She made tea because she was done with coffee for the day, and possibly for the week. She sat at the table and opened her laptop. She started the equipment list. Not because it was the most urgent thing, the federal investigation, the regulatory review, whatever Levine was going to find in those unaccounted-for phone records. None of that could be addressed with a spreadsheet, but because it was the thing she could actually do at 9:30 at night in her kitchen. And because the list was real, and the needs were real, and the work of reconstruction, which OC had said was harder than crisis, and which Elena was beginning to understand, was also more necessary, started with someone sitting down and doing it. She worked for 2 hours. At 11:41, her phone lit up with a message from an Ellsworth administrative account. Ms. Drake. Formal offer letter being prepared. Terms as discussed. Equipment review scheduled Friday 8 a.m. One additional item requires your attention. Please come to the executive suite at 7 a.m. tomorrow. There's something you need to see. She read it twice. Set the phone down. Went to bed. She slept, which surprised her. Her alarm went off at 5:45. She made coffee, was in her truck by 6:35, and arrived at Northgate at 7:03 with the equipment list printed and folded in her coat pocket, and a forward momentum that was not quite certainty and not quite calm, but had the functional properties of both. Ellsworth was waiting in the lobby. Ellsworth was not a woman who waited in lobbies. She was standing with 2 people Elena didn't recognize, both in civilian clothes, both with the specific credential lanyards of people from outside the hospital. When she saw Elena, she crossed the lobby directly. Good, she said. You're here. The unaccounted phone call from Tuesday. They found the other end. She started moving toward the elevator without slowing, and Elena kept pace beside her. Who did he call? Elena said. That's what's complicated, Ellsworth said, because the number he called belongs to someone currently on our board. The elevator doors opened. Neither of them moved for a second. Which member? Elena said. Ellsworth looked at her, named a name. The name was Gerald Fortier. Elena knew the name, the way she knew all the board members. from the organizational chart she'd looked at once early in her time at Northgate, trying to understand the structure of the place she'd decided to rebuild her career in. Fortier was the heavy-set man who'd been at the table yesterday, the one who'd looked up from the transcript page and asked Merritt with that flat, specific weight, "Did you say this?" The one who, in that moment, had looked genuinely appalled. She stood at the elevator with that landing in her like something swallowed wrong. "He was in the board meeting yesterday," she said. "Yes." Ellsworth's voice was controlled in the way of someone who had spent several hours being controlled about this and was running low on the resources required to maintain it. He participated in the vote to terminate Merritt. He voted in favor, knowing he'd received a call from him on Tuesday morning. The elevator doors, which had been patiently holding, began to close. Ellsworth put her hand out and stopped them. "The call lasted 3 minutes and 58 seconds, she said. At 6:21 a.m., Merritt's phone to Fortier's personal cell. She looked at Elena directly. 4 minutes is a conversation, not a misdial. They got in the elevator. One of the two people Elena didn't recognize, a woman in her 40s with a federal prosecutor's credential, whose name she would later learn was Investigator Diane Atchison, spoke now, concisely. "We need to walk through what you observed in the lobby yesterday before we do anything else. Your account combined with the phone records establishes a timeline we can work with." She looked at Elena. "Are you ready?" "Yes," Elena said. The elevator moved. It took 50 minutes. Atchison was thorough without being slow. Specific questions, full answers, interruptions only for clarification. The second investigator, Torres, handled the recording and said almost nothing. Ellsworth sat at the far end of the conference room table and did not speak at all, which was its own kind of communication. What emerged from those 50 minutes was a sequence Elena could now see whole. Gerald Fortier had not been a passive recipient of Merritt's call on the morning of Tuesday. According to phone records and communications recovered from one of the detained contractor's devices, Fortier had been in contact with an investment group, the same group represented in the provincial delegation tour, not as a board member performing oversight, but as an informal liaison between that group and Merritt's office. The investment group held a financial stake in a proposed data-sharing partnership with Northgate, quietly structured over 11 months and never formally disclosed to the full board. The partnership required specific patient data architecture, the kind housed in the North Annex server cluster, the kind a hardware tap would access silently and continuously. Colonel Beaulieu, arriving as an unidentified patient with intelligence-grade encrypted equipment, had created a problem for that arrangement. Once identified, Beaulieu would bring scrutiny. Scrutiny brought oversight. Oversight was incompatible with a data partnership that hadn't been disclosed because Merritt and Fortier had been operating on the assumption that disclosure was a decision they got to make. They weren't targeting Beaulieu specifically, Atchison said, with the particular flatness of someone being precise. The intrusion attempt was about the data infrastructure. His presence in the ICU created the window of institutional disruption they needed to move the equipment in. But stopping his resuscitation would have removed him as a future identification problem, Elena said. Atchison looked at her. A pause that wasn't quite confirmation and wasn't quite denial. That's one interpretation of Merritt's conduct in the Bay. The call to Fortier happened 3 minutes after Merritt entered the room and 2 minutes before he ordered you to stop compressions. Elena looked at the table, at the grain of the wood and the ordinary surface of a conference room in a hospital she'd worked in for 2 years, where a man had stood 6 feet away from her and said, "I understand the clinical risk," while making a calculation she hadn't fully understood until right now. She had known it was wrong. She had known it with the specific, unambiguous clarity of someone who had been in enough situations where the difference between right and wrong was a physical fact, rather than an abstract position. But she hadn't known the depth of it, hadn't known that what she was pushing back against in that moment was not simply arrogance or the blindness of a man who had confused authority with judgment. She'd been pushing back against something more deliberate than that. "He knew," she said, "not a question." "We believe so," Atchison said. "To what degree and with what specific intent, that's for the investigation to establish. But the regulatory review doesn't wait on the federal investigation. Those run in parallel. What the review establishes about executive interference with emergency care, the undisclosed data partnership, the documentation from Dr. O.C. and the other physicians, that goes into the report that goes to the provincial ministry. And that report has its own consequences. What kind? Elena said. The kind that end careers and require institutions to be restructured from the ground up, Atchison said. Or in this case, rebuilt so thoroughly that what comes out the other side is essentially a different organization. She looked at Elena with the direct, unornamented attention of someone who had learned to deliver difficult information cleanly. That kind of rebuilding needs people who understand what went wrong and are committed to making sure it doesn't happen in the same ways again. She paused. I'm told you've already started a list. Elena thought about the equipment spreadsheet open on her kitchen table at 11:30 the night before. The line items, the dollar amounts, the specific, unglamorous work of identifying what was broken and figuring out how to fix it. Yes, she said. Good, Atchison said. Keep going. Fortier was escorted from the building at 10:22 that morning. Elena hadn't planned to be in the lobby. She'd been in a meeting with Ellsworth and the interim administrative lead about the Friday procurement review, and the meeting had run long. When she came out of the elevator, the first thing she registered was the cluster of people near the main entrance and the particular quality of stillness that fell over a hospital lobby when something was happening that people weren't supposed to watch but couldn't look away from. Fortier was walking beside two federal officers with the posture of a man trying to appear as though the escort was voluntary. Carrying nothing. Badge already gone. His face doing the same thing Merritt's had done. Controlled, managed, withholding. But with something underneath it that Merritt's face hadn't had, the particular quality of a person who had genuinely believed until very recently that he was too careful to be standing where he was standing. He saw Elena. She was 30 feet away near the corridor junction, and his eyes found her with the automatic recognition of someone cataloging a room. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the lobby of Northgate Regional Health Centre, while the federal officers maintained their patient, unhurried proximity. She did not feel triumph. She wanted to be honest with herself about that. There was a version of this moment that the story wanted to be cathartic. The villain walks out, the hero watches, the score is settled. It wasn't like that. It was just a man who had made choices, being walked out of a building he'd helped corrupt, while the building continued to function around him because buildings did that. Because the patients on every floor above them had not stopped needing care because the governance structure was being dismantled and rebuilt. Fortier looked away first. Elena turned back toward the corridor. She had a list to finish. Patel found her in the trauma unit at 11:30. She was doing a walkthrough, not officially. Not yet. Her contract wasn't signed until Friday. But Ose had suggested it, and she hadn't said no because the equipment request list was considerably easier to build standing in the department, looking at what was actually there versus what should be there. She had a clipboard. Patel came through the bay doors and stopped when he saw her, and something in his face did the thing she recognized. The recalibration of a person who had been holding guilt at a manageable distance and was suddenly close to it. You're back, he said. Almost. Friday, officially. She made a note. The patient monitoring in Bay 4 is 2 generations out of date. I've been writing that in quarterly reports for 14 months. I know. I read them this morning. She looked up. They went to Merritt's inbox. He never responded. Patel leaned against the wall with his arms crossed and looked at her with the tired, honest regard of someone who'd been in the same building as a slow institutional disaster and was still working out what it meant about his own choices. I should have escalated past him, he said, gone directly to the board or the ministry. I had documentation. OC's support. I kept telling myself I was managing the relationship. Raymond. She set the clipboard down. I'm not interested in relitigating what you didn't do. I'm interested in what you're going to do starting next week. Hugh looked at her. The trauma unit is going to change substantially over the next year, she said. Clinical protocols, resource allocation, how decisions get escalated. She held his gaze. I need a clinical lead who's been here long enough to know what's broken and isn't so invested in how things were done that they can't adapt to how they need to be done. I want you, but I need you to actually want it, not just accept because I'm asking." He was quiet for a moment. "I want it," he said. "Good." She picked up the clipboard. "Then help me with this list." "The crash cart in the corridor has been flagged twice for calibration and hasn't been serviced," he said, pushing off the wall and coming to stand beside her. She wrote it down. They worked through the department for 40 minutes, which was the most functional 40 minutes she'd had in a week, because it was concrete and necessary. And the language of it. The specific language of equipment and protocols and the gap between what existed and what was needed was a language she'd spoken her entire adult life in one form or another, and speaking it here felt like something settling back into place. She stopped by Boyu's room at 1 o'clock. He was sitting up properly this time, not attempting it, actually managing it, propped against the raised bedhead with the careful stillness of someone who had learned precisely where the pain began and was operating just below that threshold. He looked better, not well. The bruising was deeper and more colorful at 48 hours, which was normal and looked worse than it was, but alert. He looked at her clipboard. "Equipment list," she said. "How bad is it?" "Manageable. Nothing that can't be fixed with budget and attention." She sat down. "Which is most problems, honestly." He made a sound of agreement. Then, after a moment, Dubois told me about Fortier. "She tells you a lot." "She briefs me." "There's a difference." He shifted slightly and kept the wince contained. "Were you surprised?" She thought about it. "Not entirely. The pattern made more sense with him in it." He looked at the window. Outside, the sky had finally cleared, the first real blue she'd seen in 5 days, pale and cold and wide over the Clearwater Bay roofline. "I keep thinking about the fact that he voted to fire Merritt while knowing about the call," she said. "Covering his position," Boyu said. "He figured if Merritt went down completely, the board investigation would stop there. Merritt would be the whole story." "He almost calculated it, right?" "Almost." He looked at her. It was the timing of the intrusion attempt that broke it. If they'd waited another week after the board review closed, before the regulatory audit reached the data infrastructure question, he paused. But they got nervous. People who've operated from unchecked authority for a long time get nervous fast when that authority starts moving. She thought about Merritt in the Bay, the speed of everything he did, the investor tour, the call to security, the public termination in the corridor. All of it so fast and so unqualified, the reflex of a man who had been uncontested for long enough that his first response to any challenge was to eliminate it rather than adapt. "What happens to them?" she said. "Realistically." Boyo considered the question with the directness of someone who'd spent his career adjacent to the specific overlap of federal law and institutional misconduct. Merritt faces provincial charges for the emergency care interference. That's the clearest case. It's on camera and documented. The federal piece depends on what the investigation establishes about his knowledge of the data scheme. If he knew the full scope. He paused. The federal sentencing guidelines for conspiracy to access protected infrastructure are not gentle. And Fortier? More careful with paper trails, but the phone record is real, and the contractor communications put his name adjacent to the planning. He won't walk away from it. It's a question of how far it goes. "Years," she said. "Probably," he said. They sat with that for a moment. Not dramatically, just letting it occupy the space it occupied. "You're keeping the directorship," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Good." He looked at his hands. "I want to say something and I need you to not deflect it." She waited. "What you did in that bay. I don't mean the clinical part. I mean the part where you looked at a person with institutional authority over your career and decided that authority did not extend to this moment. That's rarer than people think." He looked at her steadily. "I've spent years in environments where people make that calculation every day. How much authority does this person actually have over me right now? Most people, when they run the numbers, decide it's not worth it. They stop. They comply. They tell themselves they'll fight it later when the stakes are lower. He paused. You didn't stop. He was going to die, she said. I know. And the fact that you experience that as a simple equation, he will die if I stop, therefore I don't stop, is exactly what I'm talking about. Some people lose that. The institution trains it in, and then the institution trains it back out. The pressure to defer, to manage up, to calculate consequences before acting. He shook his head slightly. You hadn't lost it. She looked at the clipboard in her lap, at the list of deferrals and staffing gaps and things that should have been addressed 18 months ago and weren't. I've lost other things, she said. I'm not someone without damage. Nobody worth anything is. He said it plainly. I'm not describing a hero. I'm describing someone who in one specific moment knew exactly what mattered and acted on it without waiting for permission. He paused. That's enough. That's actually enough. She looked at him. The thing about being told you were enough by someone with the specific authority of a person who had nearly died and come back from it was that it went somewhere different than the same words from someone trying to be kind. It didn't resolve everything. It didn't close the file on the fly-in program, or the things she'd carried from Northern Ontario, or the 4 days she'd spent updating her resume in a dark apartment. But it landed in a specific place and stayed there, and she let it. Rest, she said. Your blood pressure was still reading high this morning. I know. The ICU nurse has informed me. She's right. She stood. I'll check on you tomorrow. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She picked up the clipboard and was at the door when he said, quietly, Elena. She turned. Whatever it cost you to rebuild that department, it'll be worth it. Not for the people who walked away from you. For the ones who don't know you yet. The ones who'll come through those doors after you. She nodded once. She walked out. The formal reinstatement happened on Friday morning, without ceremony, because Elena had been specific about that when Ellsworth's office asked about format. No assembled staff, no speech, no moment staged for institutional optics, just a conference room, the contract, the equipment review, and the people who needed to be there. Ellsworth, Dr. Osei, Patel in his new formal capacity, Atchison because the regulatory documentation required a federal witness, Levine, who arrived 4 minutes late and said nothing about why, and nobody asked, and Jordan Sue, who was there because Elena had put his name on the attendee list herself, and who sat at the far end of the table, looking like someone unsure whether they were supposed to be in the room, until Elena looked at him directly and said, "You're supposed to be here," and he straightened in his chair and stayed. The contract was thorough. The equipment review was longer than Friday morning, probably warranted, but nobody left early because the people in the room understood that what was being built, slowly, imperfectly, through line items and signatures and the grinding work of institutional repair, was the foundation of something that would outlast the crisis that had made it necessary. She signed at 9:47. Ellsworth slid a badge across the table. It said, Elena Drake, Director of Regional Emergency Trauma Services. She looked at it for a moment. A rectangle of plastic with a photo and a title. She'd had one before. A different one. A field paramedic's badge, taken from her outstretched hand by a security officer while provincial ministry staff watched through glass. She clipped this one on. Nobody made a speech. Osei said, "Welcome back," and meant it. Patel passed her a folder of the equipment approvals he'd already gotten provisionally signed, which was his way of saying something he wasn't going to put into words. Jordan said the crash cart's already scheduled for servicing and looked like he'd been waiting 3 days to say it, which he probably had. Atchison shook her hand. The regulatory report goes to the provincial ministry on the 21st. You'll want someone from your department to review it for clinical accuracy before it's finalized. Send it to me directly, Elena said. Atchison nodded and left. The meeting broke up the way meetings broke up when there was real work waiting on the other side. Levine was the last to go. He stopped at the door. The investigation is going to be in the news again, he said. Probably next week. Both names will be prominent. He paused. Your name will likely come up. I know. Okay with that? She thought about it. Actually thought about it. Not the performance of thinking. What it meant to have her name in a story about a federal investigation. To be publicly associated with an institutional failure, even as the person who'd refused to participate in it. Yes, she said, because the story is accurate. He nodded. That was enough. He left. She sat alone in the conference room for about 4 minutes. She let herself feel the weight of the week she'd just come through. Not to dwell in it, just to acknowledge it. The parking lot in the February cold. The 4 days at the kitchen table, the phone call from a number she didn't recognize, from a man who'd woken up in an ICU and wanted her to know he was alive. She had not done any of it for the badge. That was the thing she kept returning to, and the thing she found most difficult to articulate when people, Ellsworth, Beaulieu, Osei, tried to name what she'd done as exceptional. It hadn't felt like courage in the moment. It had felt like the only available option. The math was simple. If she stopped, he died. She knew how to continue. Therefore, she continued. What she hadn't calculated was the cost. She'd known there would be one, had known it the second she felt Merritt's hand on her shoulder, but she hadn't run the numbers. She just kept her hands moving. She thought about what Beaulieu had said. You hadn't lost it. And the way he'd said it. Not with admiration, with the quiet acknowledgement of someone who understood exactly how heavy the alternative would have been to carry. She thought about the version of her that had walked out to the parking lot on Tuesday morning. Coat on, plastic bag, alone in the cold at 7 a.m. And she didn't try to talk that version of herself out of the grief or the fear or the crushing uncertainty of not knowing what came next. That had all been real. The damage had been real. 4 days of real had happened to her, and she wasn't going to let anyone, including herself, sand those days smooth into a lesson with clean edges. This was not a story about how things always worked out. This was a story about one specific set of circumstances in which accountability functioned, because enough people, a colonel, a physician, a young ER tech with an email account and a conscience, a federal investigator, a board chair who was genuinely appalled, did their part. It had almost not worked. It had come within a few minutes of not working in a corridor where 3 people were trying to access a server cluster while a patient who knew too much was recovering in the ICU. The system did not save her. People did. Specific, imperfect, tired people who made decisions under pressure and mostly got them right. That distinction mattered, because the thing you believed about how accountability worked determined how you behaved when it wasn't working yet. If you believed the system would eventually correct itself without intervention, you waited. You managed the relationship. You wrote reports and sent them to inboxes and hoped. If you believed that systems were only as functional as the people inside them, you didn't stop compressions when someone in a pressed shirt told you to. She was in the trauma unit at 2 in the afternoon when the call came from the provincial ministry's patient safety division. The regulatory report had been expedited. The ministry's emergency board had voted to place Northgate Regional under a provisional oversight period. An independent administrator would review all executive decisions above a certain threshold for the next 12 months. The undisclosed data partnership was formally suspended pending a full disclosure audit. Any investment group with documented ties to the network intrusion attempt was barred from future contracting relationships with the hospital. The official who delivered this information ended by saying that the ministry had noted for the record the specific clinical conduct of the emergency trauma unit staff on Tuesday morning, and that documentation of that conduct would be included in the province's annual patient safety report. What does that mean practically? Elena said. It means it's on record, the official said, permanently, as an example of clinical practice maintained under executive interference. A pause. It also means the interference is on record permanently as a failure of executive duty to patient welfare. She thanked the official and ended the call and stood in the bay for a moment. The department around her was its ordinary afternoon self. 2 nurses managing a lac repair in Bay 1. The monitoring equipment doing its steady background work. The ambulance radio from dispatch at the nursing station, the logistics of a department doing what departments were supposed to do. She walked to the station. Jordan was updating a chart. The crash cart service is confirmed for Monday, he said without looking up. And I sent the portable defibrillator specs to procurement this morning. Good. What about the staffing rotation review? I started a draft. It's rough. Send it to me tonight. Notes back to you by morning. He looked up from the chart. He was 24 years old and had been working in healthcare for 2 years and had, at considerable personal risk, forwarded an internal communication to a fired paramedic because it was the right thing to do. He looked slightly less like someone unsure whether they were supposed to be in the room than he had this morning. Dr. Patel said you're restructuring the senior review process, he said. Can I be part of that? She looked at him. At the specific quality of someone asking a question they've already half-talked themselves out of because they're accustomed to the answer being no. I was going to ask you to lead it, she said. He stared at her. You documented this department's needs for 7 weeks and submitted a report that was ignored. You know what's broken better than anyone else on this floor. I'd be doing less than my job if I didn't put you in the room where the decisions get made. He looked back at the chart. His jaw did something that wasn't quite composed for a moment, and then he pulled it back. Okay, he said. Yes. Good. She picked up her clipboard. That staffing draft tonight. Tonight, he said. She walked back out into the bay. At 4:40, Patel appeared in the doorway of what was now technically her office, a small room off the main trauma bay that had been used for storage and still smelled faintly of cardboard, and said, "The news crew is in the lobby." She didn't look up from the procurement review. Which outlet? 2 of them, local affiliates, and the courier called the main line. Refer them to the board's communications office. I did. They'd like a statement from you specifically. She set down the pen, looked at the wall for a moment. The wall had a crack in the plaster near the ceiling that she'd noted on her first walkthrough and written on the list. Not because it was a clinical priority, but because it was the kind of thing that accumulated into the general message of a space that wasn't being maintained. Tell them I'll have a written statement by end of day, she said, and tell them it'll be short. What she wrote 40 minutes later was 4 sentences. On Tuesday morning, I did my job. The patient survived. The investigation that followed is ongoing, and I'll support it fully. What I want people to take from this is not a story about exceptional heroism. It's a reminder that the most important decisions we make are the ones nobody is watching, in the moments when stopping would be easier than continuing. Ellsworth read it before it went out and said it's very short. I know. It's also exactly right. She handed it back. Send it. Elena stopped by the ICU on her way out at 6. Boyu was awake, sitting in the bedside chair with the careful discipline of someone who had negotiated the position and was not going to waste it by moving wrong. He had a tablet on his knee and was reading something she didn't try to identify. You're leaving? He said when she appeared in the doorway. Department closes my shift at 6. Does it really work like that for a director? Not usually, she admitted. But it's my first day and I'm setting a precedent. She leaned against the doorframe. You look better. I feel worse, which they tell me means the medication is wearing off appropriately. He put the tablet down. I saw your statement. 4 sentences. 4 good ones, she said. He looked at her. The last one especially. She thought about that sentence, about what it had cost to write something that didn't perform modesty and didn't perform confidence, but tried to say the actual thing, that the moment had not been exceptional. It had been a choice available to anyone who had not yet let the weight of institutional authority convince them that the authority was more real than the patient on the table. When do you transfer? She said. 3 days. Stable enough for transport. He paused. There'll be a debrief. The identification, the circumstances of how I ended up on Highway 26, all of it. It's going to be a long process. He looked at the window. At some point in that process, what happened here will be part of the official record. I wanted you to know that what goes in that record about Tuesday, about what you did, I have input into it. He met her eyes. I intend to be specific. She looked at him in the pale, late afternoon light of the ICU room. A person who had been close to the edge of something and come back from it. Imperfect and complicated and alive because of a sequence of choices made by a person who'd been standing in the right place at the right time and had refused to move. "Thank you," she said, and meant it as simply as it sounded. "I'll be back through Clearwater Bay," he said, "when things settle. I'd like to buy you a coffee." "I'll be here," she said. She walked out of the ICU and down the corridor and into the elevator and through the lobby of Northgate Regional Health Centre. And the evening air outside was cold in the specific, clean way of Ontario in February. The sky fully dark and very clear, stars visible over the roofline. She stood on the front steps for a moment, not savoring anything, not performing anything, just standing in the cold and breathing. The week she just lived through was not a story about an exceptional person doing exceptional things. That was the version people wanted, and she understood why. It was cleaner, it had edges, that let the audience feel the satisfaction of a clear moral without having to sit with anything uncomfortable. The hero was rare. The hero was special. The hero was not you. That version was a lie she refused to tell. The truth was less satisfying and more important. She was a person with a specific skill set and a specific history, and a stubborn resistance to accepting that authority over her title was also authority over her judgment. She had been in the right place when someone needed that exact combination. A different paramedic, worn down by one more year of institutional indifference, might have hesitated a second longer. The margin was not as wide as the story wanted it to be, which was exactly why the story mattered. Because the margin narrowed every time someone was told to defer and did. Every time a report went unanswered and nobody escalated. Every time an institution decided that what it looked like was more important than what it was, and nobody said this is not acceptable and I am not going to pretend otherwise. The margin narrowed, and someday someone would be on a table. And the paramedic standing beside them would have been worn down to the point where stopping felt like the only available option. She thought about Jordan writing a staffing report over 7 weeks, about Patel documenting equipment failures in quarterly reports that went nowhere, about Osei carrying her records of merits interference for months, managing the relationship, waiting for a better moment, about all the ways people tried to work within systems that were failing them, all the quiet daily compromises that accumulated into the conditions that made Tuesday possible. None of that was cowardice. It was survival. She understood survival. But somewhere in the accumulation, the line had to hold. She had held hers. She pulled her coat tighter and walked to her truck. The city around her was its ordinary evening self. Lights on in windows, traffic on King Street, the sound of the world continuing at its usual indifferent pace. Northgate's sign glowed behind her. Tomorrow she would be back inside it at 7 a.m. with the staffing draft from Jordan and the procurement notes from Patel, and a meeting with the interim administrator about the oversight structure, and approximately 40 other things that would not be resolved in a single day or a single week or possibly a single year. Reconstruction was harder than crisis. Osei had been right about that. It was also the only thing that made the crisis mean anything. She got in the truck, started the engine, pulled out of the parking lot onto King Street and drove through the February night, and the heat came up slowly, and the radio played something she didn't quite catch, and the city moved past the windows, and she thought, tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. That was enough. That had always been enough. I keep thinking about the moment Elena pressed her hands flat against her thighs and breathed out through her nose. His heart was beating again. She had done what she came to do, and 30 seconds later, she was being walked to her locker by a security officer. That's the part I can't stop sitting with. Not the injustice of it, though it was unjust, but the specific shape of how it happened. Merritt didn't act in anger. He didn't panic. He made a calculation, clearly and calmly. And the calculation was wrong in the most fundamental way. A calculation can be wrong. It assigned no value to the life on the table. That's not a mistake you make by accident. That's what happens when a person has spent years in a position where nobody pushed back, where the reports went unanswered, where the smaller versions of the same choice were tolerated, managed, absorbed. By the time Elena was standing in that bay, Merritt had already practiced that decision 100 times in smaller rooms. He just never had to say it out loud before. And Elena, she'd practiced too, differently. She'd been on a fly-in program in Northern Ontario for 2.5 years, working in communities where the nearest backup was hours away and the equipment wasn't always right, and you made it work anyway. She had been trained, over and over, to trust her own judgment in the moment when no one else was there to confirm it. That's not a small thing. That's something you either build in yourself or you don't, and it cannot be borrowed from someone else's confidence when the pressure arrives. What strikes me most, thinking about what Elena did, is that it wasn't heroic in any dramatic sense. She didn't make a speech. She didn't confront Merritt in a hallway afterward. She removed his hand from her shoulder, adjusted her grip, and resumed compressions. The decision was already made. She just kept doing what the decision required. There's something in that I think about a lot. We talk about integrity like it's a quality you demonstrate in big moments. The moments people are watching, the moments that get written about. But I think Elena's integrity was built in the years before Tuesday morning. It was built in the way she chose to work when nobody was watching, in the way she documented problems she knew might never be read, in the way she stayed in a position that kept being underfunded and understaffed because the people in those rooms needed someone with her specific skill set, and she wasn't willing to be somewhere easier while they were there. That's what I mean when I think about what it actually takes to hold the line. It's not one decision made dramatically under pressure. It's hundreds of smaller decisions made when the stakes seemed lower, about whether to go soft, whether to defer, whether to tell yourself it isn't your fight. Elena had made those decisions the right way so many times that when the real moment came, the answer was already in her hands. And Jordan Sue, 24 years old, forwarding an internal communication to a fired paramedic because it was the right thing to do. That mattered too. Dubois showing up. Patel saying he's stable. For what it's worth, every one of those people made a choice that was inconvenient and necessary and correct. Elena couldn't have done what she did in that boardroom without them. The system didn't save her, people did. And I think that's the thing worth carrying. Not that accountability always works, but that it only works when enough individuals decide that their small part of it is worth doing. Even when they're tired, even when they're uncertain, even when stopping would be so much easier than continuing. That's the whole thing, really. That's always been the whole thing.